Hi everybody, Evan from Codify here. Welcome to week 2. And before we start, I want to stop and give a quick note with regards to Font Awesome. Because I know that in the course of building the Google replica, you've probably run across Font Awesome icons, and getting Font Awesome hooked up to your page. Now, the material in this course has already been updated to reflect the new procedure for linking Font Awesome to your page, but I just want to run through it real fast here as well. So I'm just going to Google Font Awesome, and the very first link to pop up is fontawesome.com. And the way we're going to hook this up is by using what's called a Content Delivery Network, or a CDN. This means that we're not going to download the Font Awesome files. If you'd like to, and you feel confident that you can get them hooked up correctly, feel free. It's a great idea for when you start deploying real projects, but for now, we're just going to use the CDN because it's quick, it's easy, and it doesn't require a whole lot of brain power at this point. I don't want you getting distracted by getting an external library like this to work. That's not the point. Okay, so now that I'm at fontawesome.com, I'm going to click on Get Started. And I'm going to scroll down, make sure that Web Fonts with CSS is the active item down here. Web Fonts with CSS. And right here where it says Use Font Awesome Free CDN, I come down here, I make sure free is selected, I make sure all is selected, and all I need is this link tag here. So I can manually copy this entire link tag, or you can just click this clipboard button right here, and that will copy the code. And then in your project folder, simply paste that. You might want to do this in your template just so you have it for all future templates or all future project folders. I paste the new version of Font Awesome, and note that I've labeled it with a comment. This is my template that we're looking at, so I'm going to save that, close it. Now I'm copying it, and I'm going to paste it. I'll rename it to Week 2 Discussion. Note again, camel casing, no spaces. The first letter is not capitalized. I have camel cased the first letter of discussion. Okay, and then I'm going to open that in my text editor. Okay, so we now have Font Awesome added to our template. We should have it available in all future projects. Let's go ahead and title my page. And I'm ready to code. So let's jump in. Number 1, what is the HTML for an unordered list with 3 items inside of it? Well, an unordered list is a UL element. And remember, whenever you open an element, it's always a good idea to just close it immediately, because it's very easy to forget to close an element. So this is a UL element, and now we need 3 list items inside of it. And a list item is an li tag. Let's put a little text in there. It's 1, 2, and 3. Okay, this is an unordered list with 3 list items. Let's see what that looks like. That's what that looks like. Looks like a bulleted list. If I change UL to OL, you know what's going to happen? Now it's an ordered list. That causes them to be numbered as opposed to bulleted. But I'm going to go back to UL. Number 2, what is the HTML for 2 divs, each with a class of box, and each containing an h1 element inside of a section. So first, let's create those 2 divs. Let's give them each a class of box. Class is an HTML attribute that goes inside the opening element tag. Remember that. And each containing an h1 element. So now inside of both of these divs, I'm going to insert an h1 element, and they'll just say hello world. Okay. And last part, inside of a section. Well, this is a little open to interpretation, right? Does it mean each containing an h1 element inside of a section? Or 2 divs, each with a class of box and each containing an h1 element inside of a section? I read it as 2 divs, each blah, 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 inside of a section. So what is that going to look like? Well, we're going to need to wrap our div elements inside of a section element. Having done that, I want to be sure that my indenting stays appropriate. So every time we nest a layer deeper, we want to indent forward. Now I could come here and just indent each line one by one, but that's going to get really old really fast, especially when you're writing more code. So instead, I'm going to select all of this code and hit the Tab button. Okay? If you read it the other way, then what we would need is to wrap each of these h1s in a section element and then indent like that. Number 3, what are the 4 useful new HTML5 elements? Why are they useful? Well, one of the most useful ones is a nav element. A nav element. Another useful one is a main element. There's also a header element. And there is a footer element. Why are these useful? They're useful because they help us very quickly and very easily organize all of our code. Without distinctions like nav, main, header, footer, all of these elements would probably be divs or sections. So we might have something like div, 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 section, or section, div, div, div. It gets very confusing very quickly, as you might imagine. So having unique HTML elements like footer, main, header, nav helps us very easily organize our code much more quickly. What does CSS stand for, and why is it called that? Get rid of a couple of superfluous elements first before we dive into that question. Yeah, I don't need the main either. To indent backwards, I simply highlight all of these lines and press Shift Tab. Shift and Tab. And that helps me indent backwards. So that's another useful shortcut. Okay, what does CSS stand for and why is it called that? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. Cascading Style Sheet. Now, why do you think it's called Cascading Style Sheet? Well, the reason is because the code that you write in your CSS file cascades downward in the same way that water cascades down a waterfall or down rocks. The further down the side of a waterfall is the water, the more momentum it has, which is to say that water builds up momentum and inertia as it falls faster and faster, as it cascades downward. And in a similar way, the code which you write in your CSS is subject to a hierarchy of precedence. What does that mean? Well, let's first explore where we are right now. Okay, here's my page. I'm going to select H1s, all my H1s, and I'm going to make them blue. And they're blue. Okay? But I'm going to come right below that same selector, select all my H1s again, and change them to red. So which of these selectors, which piece of code, which block of code is winning out? Which has greater precedence or greater power, greater momentum or inertia, such as it is? The answer is this second one, this second batch of code, which is lower down in my CSS style sheet. It is more powerful, and therefore it overrides this batch of code. Now you might ask yourself, why would this ever happen? Why would I ever repeat myself like this? Why wouldn't I just change this one to red and be done with it? And that's an excellent question. But let's say only one of these divs has a class of box, just the second one. Okay? And let me get rid of this for now. And rather than selecting my H1s, I'm going to select one. I'm going to select H1s inside of divs. Okay, that's what this selector is selecting. All H1s, all heading 1s, which are inside of div elements. So it's still going to select the same elements. We haven't changed what's actually going to happen on our page, but we have used a more specific selector. That's fine. Okay, so I have div H1, color blue. And let's also add another 2 H1s into the mix. Another 2 divs containing H1s, just for the heck of it, okay? So we've got 4 H1s inside of 4 divs, and one of these divs has a class of box. Well, I want all of my H1s to be blue, like this, except for this one. Except for this one. So instead, I'm going to come below and write .box H1. So all H1 elements inside of elements with the class of box. And I'm going to change its color to red. So what's happening here? This color is overriding this color. But what's really happening here? Why did I structure my code this way? Because all of my H1s inside of divs have a baseline set of styles. Like they're all going to be blue, but there's one that needs to be a different color. So I'm going to override it there. Just like that. Okay, now if your next question is, well, why not just give that unique H1 an ID and style it totally separately? Well, let's keep going. Okay, Now I've added a whole bunch of styles to all of my H1s inside of divs. They all have these baseline styles, but this one specifically has a different color. The rest of these styles are still applying to this one. They're still working. The only style which has been overridden is color, and only for the H1s which are inside of elements with the class of box. Okay, the further down your page that your code is written, the more powerful it is, the more power it has to override pre-existing code. Now there is something else at work here, and that's an issue of specificity, but we're not going to get into that just yet. Okay, what are the 3 ways to add CSS to your HTML, and which method do we use? Once again, there's an external style sheet, which we're using here. There's an internal style sheet, which would be in a style tag in your head, in which you'd write CSS. And there are inline styles, in which you add a style attribute to an element and write CSS inside that HTML attribute. Now this actually brings me to an interesting point. This inline style, color purple, is working. Okay, this is overriding. The inline style is overriding both of these colors, right? And making that first H1 purple. Why is this one in the internal style sheet not overriding it? Well, let me get to that. But first, let me say, internal and inline style sheets, never write them. Okay? They exist. You'll see them. They have a role, but that role is not one which involves being written by us as developers. Okay? External style sheets are always going to be the way to go. Now, if I drop this code into my CSS, you might think that because this code is lower down, it's more powerful. It's going to override the previous colors, both the red and the blue. But in reality, it's overriding none. The reason for that is both H1s inside of divs and H1s inside of elements with the class of box are more specific selectors than simply all H1 elements. Okay, so if I change this to div H1, just like this selector, that will successfully override this color. If I change it to .box space H1, it will successfully override this color here. So, all else being equal, the further down in your code a style occurs, the more powerful it will be, absolutely. But in CSS, specificity is king. Currently, this is the most specific selector in my style sheet. So even if I placed it all the way at the top in the weakest possible position, it will still work because it is the most specific selector. Okay, all else being equal, which means if your selectors are the same or are the same level of specificity, the lower down the code is, the more powerful it will be. All right, there's a lot to keep in mind when it comes to CSS selectors, and a lot of it will come with experience, a lot of it will come with practice and trial and error, but little by little we will get you there. Don't get too bogged down in this. Understand that code lower down on your page is more powerful, and code inside a more specific selector is more powerful. Those are the two rules of thumb that you need for CSS right now. What are the three types of CSS selectors? Which is the most specific and the least? Well, this is an element selector. H1, div, image, H6, paragraph, nav. These are all element selectors. Then we have, let me label this actually, element selectors, sometimes called type selectors. And then we have class selectors. And class selectors select elements by class name. And those are things like .box, .intro, .hello. These are class selectors. And finally, there are ID selectors. And ID selectors use the hashtag. Hashtag CTA, hashtag goodbye, hashtag logo. These are ID selectors. Element or type selectors are the least specific, as you might have guessed. ID selectors are the most specific. Okay, least specific, most specific. And class selectors are in the middle. Using the most specific selector possible. Okay, that's important. Using the most specific selector possible. How would you select a UL? How would you select an unordered list? The answer to that is UL. How would you select a UL inside of a div? Well, when you're selecting elements inside of other elements, you want to kind of work backwards. So we have a UL inside of a div. You want to start from the end and work backwards. How would you select an element with a class of nav? How do we select an element with a class of nav? That's .nav. Okay, note that .nav should not be confused with a nav element selector. .nav is looking for something like a div with a class of nav. Now that is confusing, and you might not ever want to do that because there is an identically named element, but it's something to keep in mind. You will often see things with classes of navigation, for which nav is short. Okay? Using the most specific selector possible, how would you select an element with a class of nav inside of a div? So we're going to do the same thing. An element with a class of nav, which is inside of a div. We work backwards. And finally, how would you select a button inside of a div with an ID of intro? So we have a button, which is inside of a div, and that div has an ID of intro. Okay, this is an interesting one. This is a tricky relationship, which is to say div.box selects all divs with the class of box. Okay? But div space dot box selects all elements with the class of box which are inside of divs. That is a subtle difference, but an important one. Whenever you see this space in CSS, we are going inside of an element. This is a div with the class of box. This is an anything with the class of box inside of a div. Okay? Excuse me. Now, what are the 4 values we've learned that you can change the CSS position property to? Well, we have position static. We have position relative. We have position absolute and position fixed. There are others, but you don't need to know them right now. An excellent place to go to learn more about these is, as always, W3 Schools. They have a very nice demonstration for this property. And the key things to remember here, I really, really insist that you open up this Try It Now window and experiment with this absolutely positioned H2. Change the positioning, change these properties as well, and hit run, and it will move. You'll see how it reflects on the code over here, how the code is reflected on the live page over here. I insist that you practice this because there is no way to internalize how these position properties work without using them. So I'm going to run through them now. Position static is the default position of any element. Okay, when you render an element on the page, it is automatically, by default, position static. Okay? Position relative allows an element to be moved relative to its static position. In other words, let me come in here and get rid of these and change this to position. Well, let's do static first. Position static and hit run. Okay, so this H2 is what we should be looking at. This is the static position of the H2. This is the default. Now I'm going to change static to relative. And nothing changes. Okay, nothing changes because position relative does not, on its own, move an element. What it does is it allows an element to be moved relative to its static position. So this is its static position. It's still there. But now we can come in here and add things like left 25 pixels. And what this will do is push 25 pixels against its left side. Let's try 50. Okay? And then we can also do things like top 50 pixels. Okay, we are moving this element relative to its static position, and its static position is still being kept empty. It's not being filled. It's just an empty space. It's like it's a reserved parking spot, and the other elements know that nothing can park there except for this H2. Okay, so with position relative and moving elements, we can obviously cause elements to overlap each other, which can be problematic, or it can be a stylistic choice. Or we can very neatly reposition elements exactly where we want. If we want, say, to indent something and we can't just hit the tab button, well, that works. Sometimes you might have an image that you just need to just slightly reposition, just so. Okay, that's position relative. Now let me get rid of this left, and let me change this to position absolute. Okay, position absolute. So what happened? Let me jump back to relative. And then absolute. Okay, so what's the first thing that we see? Well, one, position absolute causes an element to be ignored by all other elements. That's part one. Causes an element to be ignored. See, it has no more reserved parking space. It's been taken up by this paragraph element. The other elements are pretending as though this H2 does not exist. It's like it's a ghost. But we can also still reposition it. So what happens if I write bottom 0? Yeah, let's just do that for now. Look at where it jumps. It jumps to the very, very bottom of the window. How about top 0? Jumps to the very, very top. And then, of course, there's left and right 0. Let's try right. Let me make my page bigger. See the H2? It's sticking to the right side of the window. Okay? So not only does it cause itself to be ignored by other elements, but it also allows an element to be positioned relative to the borders of the window. Okay, not relative to its original static position, but relative to the borders of the window. Position absolute is generally a little more dangerous than position relative. Sometimes you need it, but it is more dangerous. It can cause more problems. It can have some unpredicted effects on your layout. And especially when we start making our sites responsive, absolute can be a real bear to control. It's not impossible, and it can be an invaluable skill, but it is a bear to control. Okay, that's position absolute. It causes it to be ignored by other elements, and it allows you to position that element relative to the borders of the window. Okay, I could do something like right 50 pixels, 50 pixels, and bottom 100 pixels. And now it's going to be 50 pixels from the right side of the window and 100 pixels from the bottom of the window. So as I drag my window out, 100 pixels from the bottom, 50 pixels from the right, and it will stick there. So it can be a very, very useful property. And finally, position fixed. To see position fixed, we're going to need to look at a real-world example like Grubhub. Watch this Grubhub nav bar, this big old nav bar, as I scroll down the page. You see how this nav bar stays with us? It's fixed in its position to the top of the window. Okay? So position fixed elements behave identically to absolute, but stay fixed in their position on the window, even as a user scrolls down the page. Okay? But it is important that it behaves identically to an absolute element, which means to position it, you need to position it the way you would an absolute element, left, right, bottom, top, the same values. And it is also ignored by other elements. Okay? It sticks to its position in the window and it stays there even as you scroll up, down, left, right, doesn't matter. Okay? That is position fixed. Now who can tell me the other three? If you don't know them, you may need to look them up. So go ahead and look up the other three properties, other three values for the position property, or more. And don't worry about what they mean. I'm not going to go through them right now, but take a look. Practice using W3 schools to investigate the position property and find all of the values which it accepts. All of the possible values which it accepts. How would you write the CSS to change an element's font size to 25 pixels and its font to bold? Well, we use the font size property, set it to 25 pixels, and for bold, we need a new property called font weight. And font weight can take bold, or normal, or light, or lighter, bold and bolder, but it can also take something like 400, 800, 900 is very bold, 100 is very light, 400 is normal. Either of those, normal or bold, are very, very valid values for font weight. What is the CSS for adding an image to an element? Adding an image to an element. Think outside the box. The question asks for the CSS for this, so the answer is not an HTML image element. Well, let's get rid of everything except one div. Okay, and I'm going to make this div a little tall. Didn't save my HTML. There we go. Okay, so the div is about 300 pixels tall. Let me just give it a background color. Or no, I'll give it a border so we can see exactly how tall it is. Okay, this is our div, and it's got an H1 in it. So we want to put an image inside this element in CSS. In order to do that, let me first say I have a couple of images in here that we can use. So let me first add an image using an image element so we can compare. This would be image source is the images folder, and the image itself is tony.jpg. Okay, there's my image. Note how it's overflowing the page completely. So you just jump in here and give it a max width of 100%. There, now it's never going to be wider than the size of my page, size of my window. It's just a little trick. But that image is only there for demonstration purposes. This is an HTML image element leading to tony.jpg inside my image folder. Now to add an image using CSS, we're going to need to use the background image property, which takes a value that looks like this. URL, opening parentheses, closing parentheses. And inside those parentheses is where we feed the image file path. Important thing to note. Let's take a look at our folder. When using an image element that we have written inside our index.html, what's the path? The browser pokes its head out and it makes its first turn towards the images folder, right? Image folder. So from index.html, it looks for the image folder. It goes inside that folder and looks for this image. There he is. It finds it. That's great. But where are we writing this file path? We're not in index.html anymore. We're in main.css. We're starting from a block over. So our instructions, our directions need to be a little different. We're starting from here. So if I used this same file path and told the browser to look for the image folder, from its starting point, it's not going to see it. It's just going to get lost. It's just going to hit a dead end and stop, give up. So the first thing it needs to do is get out of this CSS folder and then go to the image folder. Go inside and look for Tony. Okay, first we need to get to the original block. We need to get to the original corner, and then the directions start the way we'd expect. So there's an extra step in here to tell the browser to first go back one directory. We use ... /. This will cause it to exit the current directory, to exit the CSS folder, so that it's here in our root directory. And then we can just use the same old file path. Okay, this is important. Understanding how to use it, what it means, is important. Being able to read relative file paths and write relative file paths is going to be critical. All right, so if I do that, save my page, reload, Tony, the image, is now inserted into our div. It's there, it worked. Now some issues are he's way too big. So how could I deal with that? Well, hopefully, if you needed to on your own, you would go to W3 Schools and start looking it up. But there is a background size property. I'm going to give it a value of cover. If you don't know what that is, look it up. There's background repeat. I'm going to tell it I don't want it to repeat. There's also background position. And let's just say center, center. Okay, so that worked. Problem is he's a little cut off, so maybe I want to change background position to center left. Well, now he's more in frame, but he's still way too big. Why is he too big? Let's change cover to contain. Actually, that's kind of perfect. He's right in the middle. That's not, he's no longer too big, but now he's actually too small to cover the height of the div. So that's why he was running off the page. Let's change this back to cover. Make our div a little shorter. And he's perfect. Okay, so there are many, many ways you can handle sizing and positioning your images, even if they're background images. You can obviously use position on an image element, but on a background image, there's no shortage of these background properties that you can use to get it just right. And if center left sounds a little vague, well, you can do center 10%. What do you think that's going to look like? I don't know. Why don't you try it? All right. Which uses an href attribute, an image, or a link? The answer is a link. Okay, links use hrefs, images use source. Which uses a source attribute, an anchor, or an image element? Well, an image element uses a source. Anchors also use hrefs. Images use source, anchors use href, links use href. Very commonly mixed up. Okay? All right.